There are a few candidates that I've yet to talk about, and given that the elections are right around the corner, I'm just gonna talk about the most popular leftist. I've talked about the far left before, but I avoided talking about this guy to make a full video about him. And now I'm also just tired of hearing people praising him, so here I am. So, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Pretty interesting candidate. He campaigned around some good economic position. From making necessary goods affordable to increasing the minimum wage, there are some things to like about this program. There are some good points about education as well. To keep the fight against student poverty and youth unemployment, which has been a pretty big conversation during the last 5 years. There's also the fuel price that he wants to block at €1.4 per liter, which can be considered a good thing. He has some pretty good ideas, and he is third in the polls for some good reasons. So why the title of this video? Why do I dislike him so much that I would rather vote for a fucking neolib? Well, there are a few dark spots within his campaign that I cannot ignore as much as those who support him do. And I don't mean small disagreements like voting at age 16, which is something I would like to avoid. I mean things like Europe. I believe that Europe today is a flawed alliance that is necessary. I think it can be strengthened and should, and changed to some sort of federation. This would allow us to pretty easily leave NATO for an EU alternative, and allow us for a better autonomy when it comes to trade with the rest of the world. So it's a shame that Mélenchon wants to work with an opposition to Europe, because he thinks that the EU will block his program. He says that of all the promises that Europe had when it was created, none of them were true. So he just criticizes it rather than providing any solutions, because the overall goal isn't to fix Europe, it's to leave it. Mélenchon won't say that though, because it's not exactly a popular talking point. But in 2017, during the last elections, it was. So he was pretty open about this. I wonder why he's not talking about this anymore. We'll come back to that later. Another place where he ends up just limply gesturing at foreign policy is Russia. While his response to the war in Ukraine has been close to perfect, he keeps pointing at NATO as the fault of it, which is wrong, obviously. Well, he isn't saying openly that it's the fault of NATO once again. He just says that he warned about NATO expansion in the past when talking about this. It's probably why Mélenchon also praised Russia's action within Crimea and Syria, justifying the first with NATO expansion and the second with ISIS. So in general, he cozies up with Russia whenever possible. But that's not all. What do you have in mind when we talk about mandatory conscription? Or just mandatory service in general? I'm sure you can muster some image of the young Russians being sent to die on the front lines with close to no rations or training. Well, that's what I have in mind too. And Mélenchon is for a return of this system in France. He wants to make it so everyone from 20 to 25 has at least 9 months of training in military service. And while 9 months isn't much, it doesn't take into account that trained people remain in the army reserve for a while. Now, if you have in mind this idea that a candidate that is very bad at foreign policy, but also wants mandatory conscription, you might realize that this is an atrocious combination that would just end up sending people to die. You can also realize that for a country that did send its people to die in the Algerian War, and seemed to have learned from that lesson, maybe, just maybe, we should have kept that lesson close to our hearts and not violate human rights? Because that's what it is. Mandatory conscription is a way of bolstering your army with more bodies to throw in the front line, or more people to pay cheap for complex maneuvers. And that's supposed to be a leftist program? This is where I come to my last point. I think Mélenchon is just an opportunist. His program and even party names change depending on the popular talking points at the time. Here's an example. In 2008, he left the Socialist Party to create his own, so that for the 2012 elections, when it was popular to talk about being at the front of a new movement, the party was called the Leftist Front. 5 years ago, he renamed his party to France Insoumise, or Rebellious France, because it was a popular talking point by then, and we experienced a lot of protests. Today, his party is called Popular Union, because the left in France has talked a lot about uniting under one single banner to win the elections, an effort that Mélenchon did not take part in. Are you seeing a pattern here? He dropped his argument on leaving Europe because they would make him unpopular today after Brexit. He promoted the use of hydroxychloroquine, a fake COVID cure presented by a fraud because it was popular to talk about it. So I'm sorry, I'm not gonna trust him. His takes have been consistently shit and only made to be the opposition. And that's something I criticize a lot about the right. They don't take a position, they simply are the opposition. And Mélenchon is either that or. We can see a certain pattern in the way he talks and behaves that shows a lot of nationalism and authoritarianism. The reason why he wants to leave the EU is because he wants more control over the country and less restrictions in general. The reason why he wants to leave NATO is because he wants more control over his army and he wants out of as many foreign agreements as possible. And you can only guess why he wants mandatory conscription or why he is hesitant to condemn Russia without throwing NATO under the fire as well. He also seems to think that his position within the government and candidacy allow him some amount of impunity. Hence, some of his famous words, I am the Republic and my person is sacred. And while those might have been pronounced out of anger, it's kind of revealing. He isn't on the left in my opinion, he's just a glorified Bonapartist. And that's why I won't vote for him. Alright, rant on. Be kind to each other.